What made the Middle Ages so insanely deadly? It wasn't just bad luck or poor choices. It was the way life was wired. Death didn't creep in now and then like a rare guest. It basically pulled up a chair and stayed for dinner. For people living during that time, danger wasn't an exception. It was the default. One of the biggest threats? Disease. And not just your average cold, the Black Death. Yeah. That plague rolled through Europe from 1347 to 1351 and wiped out somewhere between 30 to 60% of the population. Imagine walking into a market with 10 people by the end of that pandemic. Maybe 3 or 4 would still be standing. It was apocalyptic. The bubonic plague was mainly spread by fleas hitching rides on rats. And guess what? Medieval towns were pretty much heaven for rats. Garbage rotted in the streets, human waste went wherever gravity took it, and rats had free access to homes, castles, you name it. Even kings, with all their golden guards, couldn't buy their way out of it. Germs didn't care about royalty. Medical understanding back then? Let's just say it left a lot to be desired. Most doctors believed that diseases came from bad air, or what they called miasma. So their solution was simple: stay away from smelly places and hope for the best. That was their version of science. Other theories blamed sin. People thought illnesses were God's punishment for bad behavior. The treatment? Less medicine, more prayer. So if you had smallpox, tuberculosis, or leprosy, the prescription was more time at church, not antibiotics. Smallpox left survivors with scars for life. Tuberculosis slowly wrecked your lungs while you just kept working. Leprosy made body parts rot away, and then came the social rejection. You didn't just suffer physically, you became a complete outcast. Dysentery would basically turn your intestines into a disaster zone and kill you in a matter of days. And if the diseases weren't enough, the way people lived made everything worse. Towns were packed tighter than a can of sardines. Families lived in one-room homes with their pigs, chickens, and goats. That's not a metaphor. Your roommates could literally be farm animals. The water situation, a nightmare. Wells were dug next to outhouses. Rivers were used for both drinking and dumping waste. So yeah, that cup of water might have taken a detour through a cesspit. People started drinking weak beer and wine instead, not because they liked the taste, because alcohol was safer than the water and the medical treatments. Often worse than doing nothing. Bloodletting was common. Doctors would drain blood from already weak patients, thinking it would restore balance. It was like trying to fix a flat tire by letting out more air. Medieval surgeries? You'd be better off with a prayer and a goodwill. Surgeons reused tools without cleaning them, bouncing from patient to patient like they were hosting a death raffle. They didn't have gloves, sterilization, or anesthesia, just saws, knives, and bad ideas. Quarantines existed, but were basically lockdowns gone wrong. Officials would nail boards over the doors of infected home sounds. Smart until you realize. They were trapping healthy family members inside with the sick. Wealthier folks could sometimes bribe their way out. The poor, not so lucky. Children were especially vulnerable. Many families didn't even name babies until they were a few years old, because losing kids to disease was just expected. It was unusual for a family to bury 2 or 3 children before one reached their 5th birthday. But disease wasn't the only deadly threat. There was also warfare, and it wasn't clean or strategic like you see in video games. Medieval combat was like playing a full-contact sport with real swords and zero safety rules. Sure, knights wore shiny armor, but that didn't make them invincible. Underneath all that metal was a human being who bled, bruised, and broke just like anyone else. That armor? It was more like an expensive costume at a very real, very dangerous knife fight. Battles were brutal and personal. Soldiers fought up close with swords, maces, and axes, weapons designed specifically to shred through both armor and flesh. The aim wasn't just to win, it was to maim and kill in the ugliest way possible. The biggest killer on the battlefield wasn't always the wound itself, it was infection. A cut from a sword might not take you out instantly, but give it a few days, and gangrene could finish the job. Flesh would literally rot away, and there was no coming back from that. Survival rates for battle wounds were around 50%, which, let's face it, are terrifying odds. That S like flipping a coin every time you got hit and hoping you picked the right side of fate. Weapons like warhammers could smash bones through metal armor. Crossbows fired bolts that could pierce through a knight's breastplate like paper. These weapons weren't just dangerous, they were designed to be horrific. Safety wasn't even in the vocabulary of medieval weapon makers. And then there was the armor itself. A full suit could weigh 60 pounds or more. Imagine running into battle in summer heat, wearing all that, while people try to stab you. Knights sometimes died from overheating inside their own suits. Others drowned when they fell into rivers' armors, not exactly swimwear. Battles could last for hours or even stretch across multiple days. Soldiers were often exhausted, starving, and dehydrated, but they still had to fight. Rain turned the battlefield into mud pits. Try swinging a sword when you're ankle-deep in muck, slipping every few seconds. It was like fighting in a pigsty during a thunderstorm. Army camps weren't much better. Thousands of men packed into dirty camps with no sanitation, sharing food, water, and diseases. Spoiled rations gave soldiers food poisoning so often that nausea before battle became normal. Battlefield medicine? Basically saw off the damaged part and hope the patient doesn't scream too much. Tools weren't cleaned between uses, so infections spread like wildfire. Pain relief meant alcohol if you were lucky, and maybe a piece of leather to bite on. Many didn't die from their injuries, they died from shock during the operation. Those too wounded to keep marching were left behind. And in the chaos afterward, scavengers would roam the battlefield, looting corpses and finishing off survivors. If disease and warfare weren't enough to ruin your week, hunger was always waiting in the wings. Food security in medieval Europe was basically a gamble. You couldn't count on much, not the weather, not the harvest, and definitely not the next meal. Take the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a massive climate disaster caused by relentless rain and unusually cold temperatures. Crops didn't just fail, they rotted in the ground. Whole fields of wheat and barley turned into soggy compost. Before they could be harvested, farmers watched helplessly as their food supply dissolved into mush. Even when food grew, it was often moldy or spoiled, but people ate it anyway. What other option was there? It was either risk food poisoning or starve. That wasn't a choice, it was a survival reflex. Grocery shopping during a famine was like playing Russian roulette with your stomach. And prices, outrageous. A loaf of bread that normally cost a few coins could suddenly cost a week's wages. Families sold everything they owned just to afford a few days' worth of food. Black Friday today looks like a meditation retreat compared to what happened at bakeries during food shortages. The wealthy had a bit of cushion, stored grain, preserved food, but even that only went so far. When crops failed across entire regions, there simply wasn't anything to buy. Some nobles got so desperate they ate the grain meant for planting next year. That meant short-term survival, but long-term disaster. Poor families had to make heartbreaking choices. Parents gave their portions to their kids. Some slowly starved themselves too, by their children a few more days of life. Others left their babies at monastery doors, praying the monks had more food than they did. Starvation wasn't just about feeling weak, it turned your body into a target. Hunger weakened immune systems, making even minor illnesses deadly. People became like injured animals, easy prey for the diseases that were already everywhere. The Little Ice Age made everything worse. Shorter growing seasons, colder springs, more crop failures. Desperate people did desperate things. They ate tree bark, grass, dirt mixed with flour. Horses, dogs, cats, even rats ended up in cooking pots. Leather shoes and belts were boiled into soup to scrape together a few calories. Hunger didn't just eat away at your body, it ate away at society. Theft and robbery spiked. Bandits raided villages, stealing food, grain, and livestock. Grain riots erupted when bakeries ran out of flour. People blamed merchants, millers, or anyone suspected of hoarding. Even when the rains finally stopped and crops started growing again, recovery took years. Farmers had to rebuild from nothing, restock animals, fix tools, replant fields. That's not a weekend project. That's a generational struggle. And this brings us to the homes people were living in, which didn't help the situation at all. Most medieval homes were so rough that modern prison cells would feel like hotel rooms by comparison. You had maybe 1 or 2 rooms. If you were lucky, your house had wooden beams. If not, your walls were made of wattle and daub sticks woven together, slathered with a mix of mud, manure, and straw. It was like living inside a mud pie with a roof. Everyone shared the space: parents, children, grandparents, and livestock. Yep, pigs, chickens, goats, even cows lived right there with you. They provided heat in the winter, but also fleas, lice, and smells. That would make a modern tenant call the health department immediately. There was no proper flooring, just packed dirt, sometimes covered in straw or rushes. These coverings weren't changed often, usually only when the stench became unbearable. Over time, they collected bits of food, animal droppings, spilled liquids, basically turning the floor into a giant compost pile you walked on daily. And then there's bathing, or the lack of it. Many people believed that too much bathing was dangerous, that it opened up your pores and let illness in. So most folks only washed a few times a year, not a typo a year. Medieval hygiene was like following advice from someone who thought soap was a scam. You might splash your face with water now and then, but full-body baths? Rare and often reserved for the wealthy, or special occasions. And dental care? Non-existent. People regularly lost teeth from infection, accidents, or just chewing bread filled with grit from stone mills. Toothaches were a part of life. Something hurt enough, you pulled it out yourself, or found someone willing to yank it for you. Toilets? Think hole in the ground, and not much more. Outhouses were common, but if it was raining, freezing, or dark out, people often just used chamber pots and dumped them in the street the next morning. Sewers weren't really a thing. Streets, rivers, and cesspits became medieval garbage dumps. So not only were people cramped into tiny homes with animals and terrible sanitation, but they were also constantly battling pests. Fleas and lice lived in everyone's hair, clothing, and bedding. Rats and mice roamed freely, helping themselves to grain, scraps, and anything vaguely edible. Pest control was limited to cats, prayers, and giving up. There weren't exterminators or traps, just a general acceptance that you'd always be outnumbered by bugs and vermin. And as if living in these conditions wasn't dangerous enough, people still had to leave their homes to survive, which often meant traveling through a world that was even more hazardous. Traveling in the Middle Ages? It was like signing up for a medieval version of Survivor, except the prize was possibly not dying. Ouch. Roads were more like dirt paths, if you were lucky. Rain turned them into swamps, and in dry weather, they became dust clouds. Bridges were rare, often broken, or so badly built, you had to pay a toll just to risk falling off. Rivers had to be forded, which meant walking through them, or trying to float across on something sketchy. Not ideal. Travelers were exposed to the elements sun, rain, cold, and often trapped for days if the weather turned. But the worst part, disease hitched a ride on all of it. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims unknowingly carried bacteria and viruses from one place to another. Trade routes became disease highways. Every ship that docked in a city brought more than cargo. It brought plague rats, contaminated goods, and sick sailors. Ships were especially bad. Think of them as floating rat hotels. The rats lived in the grain holds, reproducing faster than the ship's cats could handle. Once the ship hit port, the rats and their fleas got off and went sightseeing through nearby towns. And it wasn't just the plague. All kinds of illnesses made the rounds. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, you name it. And because communication was so slow, entire communities could get infected. Before anyone realized there was an outbreak, port cities like Venice or Genoa were hit hardest, had global trade connections, and saw constant waves of new diseases rolling in from every direction. They were basically airports for germs, except with zero health checks and no quarantine protocols that actually worked. Even religious pilgrimages, which were supposed to bring people spiritual healing, ended up spreading disease far and wide. Thousands of people from all over Europe gathered in one place, praying, hugging, eating, sneezing, and then went home to infect their entire village. If you thought disease, famine, and filth were the end of it, buckle up, because the Middle Ages also came with a big, steaming side of violence and political chaos. If you were just trying to live a quiet life, too bad. The world outside your door was filled with conflict, instability, people with swords who thought every disagreement should end in bloodshed. Let's start with government, or what passed for it back then. Medieval politics made modern dysfunction look like a well-oiled machine. Power was scattered across a messy feudal system. Kings, nobles, bishops, and local lords all claimed authority, and none of them played nicely. When leaders disagreed, which was often they didn't debate, they fought. Literally. Disputes over land, taxes, or family insults turned into armed conflicts, and ordinary people got stuck in the crossfire. Forget voting or public input. Medieval political campaigns were decided by whoever had the bigger army or sharper sword. The feudal system was supposed to provide order and protection. Peasants worked the land, and in return, their lord would defend them. But in practice, it created a patchwork of mini kingdoms, each run by its own private army. These lords enforced their own laws, collected taxes, and often acted more like mob bosses than noble protectors. And when things went sideways, which they often did, justice was anything but just. Courts were inconsistent and easily manipulated. The outcome of a trial often depended more on your social rank or ability to pay a bribe than the actual evidence. Think of it like playing poker, but the dealer's working for the other guy. Some cases were decided through trial by combat, where legal disputes were settled with sword fights. That's right, you could literally fight to the death to prove you were right. Legal drama, try actual drama with blood. And then there were the private armies, which were supposed to keep the peace. But when lords couldn't pay their mercenaries, those armed men turned into roaming bands of thugs, pillaging villages, stealing food, and demanding protection money. Law enforcement, more like lawless enforcers. All of this created a constant atmosphere of fear and instability. Communities couldn't trust the people meant to protect them, and corruption ran through every layer of society. Officials expected bribes like it was part of their salary. Judges sold verdicts to the highest bidder. Tax collectors pocketed most of what they gathered, and the consequences were brutal. Public executions, torture, and harsh punishments were common. Whether or not you actually committed a crime often didn't matter, especially if someone in power wanted you out of the way. Witch hunts and religious persecution added more gasoline to the fire. Fear of the unknown turned neighbors into enemies. All it took was one accusation, she's a witch, and your life could be over. People were burned, drowned, or stoned based on rumors and superstition. No evidence, no trial, no appeal, just paranoia dressed up as justice. And it wasn't just isolated incidents. Entire regions could fall into chaos because of succession disputes. When a king died without a clear heir, his kingdom often became a battleground, with rival nobles each claiming the throne. These weren't polite disagreements. They turned into full-blown wars that devastated farmland, destroyed villages, and killed thousands. Meanwhile, border regions were constantly under threat from raiders, invaders, or neighboring powers testing each other's strength. Towns near political boundaries often changed hands multiple times in a generation, leaving the local population stuck in the middle again. The result of all this chaos? Trade broke down. Roads fell into disrepair. Markets vanished. Crops couldn't be planted. Life, which was already hard, became nearly impossible. This is what made the Middle Ages so deadly. It wasn't one single thing. It was everything, happening all at once. You weren't just dodging one kind of disaster, you were living in a perpetual state of crisis. Let's recap. Disease, constant and unpredictable. The Black Death alone wiped out entire towns. Hunger, always looming. One bad harvest could mean mass starvation. Warfare, relentless. Whether it was battles, bandits, or mercenaries, violence was everywhere. Living conditions, abysmal. Homes were dirty, crowded, and crawling with pests. Government, corrupt and chaotic. Protection came with a price and no guarantees. And yet somehow, people survived. Despite everything, the plagues, the famines, the constant wars, and medieval people didn't just curl up and give up. They endured. They adapted. They built cathedrals, copied manuscripts, founded universities, and kept entire cultures alive during one of the most unforgiving periods in human history. It's easy to look back and see only the misery. But the truth is, the resilience of medieval people was extraordinary. They found ways to laugh, love, worship, and build families, even while death lurked around every corner. And out of that struggle, they laid the foundation for the modern world. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, scientific discovery, better healthcare, all of it came because earlier generations survived a time when every day could be your last. The Middle Ages weren't just a dark age. They were a crucible, and out of that pressure, humanity moved forward.